Thank you very much for joining us here in the Situation Room. Earlier today, you accused the United States of having language that was too soft. You said earlier on CNN that some of the first statements from Washington were pursued by the Russians as almost a green light for doing this because they were too soft. There was an ultimatum that was given by a Russian official to the United States that said the Bush administration either backs Russia or Georgia. We heard from Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice just moments ago. I want you to take a listen to what she said.
As to choosing, the United States has made very clear that it is standing by the democratically elected government of Georgia.
Are you satisfied with her statement? What more do you want the Bush administration to do in terms of support?
I never accused the United States in first place of anything. I just said that Russians mistook some of the statements at certain level that, for inability of the U.S. to react to flagrant violation of every international law and any principles of justice. What we've been witnessing for the last days is a brutal, calculated, cold-blooded, premeditated murder by Russia of a small democracy on its borders. And it's not about Georgia or choosing between Georgia and Russia for the United States. It's about choosing whether the U.S. is willing to stand up for freedom, not to lose the whole region, not to lose Eastern and Central Europe, not to lose Central Asia and Caspian and wider Middle East, and succumb to Russian pressure and succumb to never-ending appetites and ultimatums of militarist, rhetorics in Moscow and of the people who are committing war crimes right now on my territory. And this is a very, very fundamental issue. And this is not about Georgia is not like Neville Chamberlain said about Czechoslovakia, and it's in '38 that why should we care about faraway country of which we know very little? Well, they gave up Czechoslovakia, they compromised in Munich, and the huge tragedy of Second World War with tens of millions of people that have followed. Now what we have now is, what we really have now is Georgia being, Georgia being attacked. And I think this is just starting of a big chain of events that might unfold if Georgia falls.
Mr. President?
People in the West and the world don't stand up for freedom.
Mr. President, specifically, you spoke with President Bush earlier today. What did he promise you? What has he said in terms of the United States' help or aid to your country?
President Bush expressed unwavering support for Georgia's elected government, for our independence and territorial integrity. And there will be no compromise at the expense of our territorial integrity, like there were compromises in the past in terms of appeasing one dictatorship or another that was in the past century. The U.S. was famous for never making such deals. The U.S. is the only big democracy in the world that never went for appeasement and never went for all kind of shady deals. That's the main force and appeal of the U.S. for every small and big nation worldwide. That's why my people are so sympathetic of the United States. That's why we had forces in Iraq to fight for the U.S. and our people died there, but we never ever asked for extra gratitude because we have common values. We share those values. And what Russia is trying to kill right now in Georgia is not just killing my country and getting rid of me as its president, but it's about killing the idea of freedom, democracy, and future for the whole region. And that's a very, very essential dilemma.
Well, some fear the crisis in Georgia may be just the beginning and that Russia may have other plans, including some Washington might consider to be very ominous possibilities. CNN's Brian Todd is working that part of the story. Brian, good to have you with us. What is the biggest concern?
Well, one of the biggest concerns, Namwa, is that the Russians are trying to exert more control over the former Soviet republics. Now, Vladimir Putin has said that letting those republics become independent was his country's biggest mistake of the 20th century. And experts say at the very least he wants to send them a message. A military rout, throwing an overmatched rival into a state of panic. The push into Georgia, analysts say, has a huge ulterior motive. A signal from the Kremlin to other former Soviet republics on its border.
Be careful, because if we don't like what you're doing, in a worst-case scenario, you'll get our tanks coming over your border as well.
Jonathan Elkind spent 3 years dealing with Russia on Bill Clinton's National Security Council. An immediate worst-case scenario, he says, is that Russia's doing more than just protecting its sympathizers in the Georgian regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia,
but is actually trying to come down into Georgia and perhaps even conquer the entire country.
Conquer and possibly depose Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili. Next, he says, Ukraine could be in Russia's sights. Like Georgia, Ukraine has angered the Russians by requesting membership in NATO. Elkind and other Russia experts say Vladimir Putin, Russia's president turned prime minister, has already tried to intimidate Ukraine.
He said, allegedly as a hypothetical, that if Ukraine entered NATO, then Russia would have to talk about having targeting its missiles on Ukraine.
Maybe even more chilling, Elkind says the U.S. couldn't do much in response to help Georgia or Ukraine beyond heavy diplomatic pressure. The U.S. couldn't defend them militarily since they're not yet full NATO members, and America's military is already stretched thin in Iraq and Afghanistan. Russian leaders know that, and some worry they may not stop with Georgia or Ukraine. Now, that means that countries like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan, all of whom either planning to pipe oil through Georgia into Western markets or already doing so, could find themselves intimidated by Moscow. They could see their borders destabilized by the Russians, by ethnic Russians in those areas, all prodded by Moscow. Now, Jonathan Elkind says it's not likely that Russia will invade all of these countries, but he says they could certainly use economic and other leverage against them. He says that Moscow now takes the view, why buy these countries when you can use them for free to get what you want? Namwa?
Wow, that sounds mercenary. All right, what about the former Baltic republics? Some of the leaders of those nations actually stood alongside Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili at that huge rally in support of his nation. So clearly they don't get along with Russia. Could they possibly be targets?
Well, Jonathan Elkind says they probably wouldn't be targeted militarily since they're full members of NATO, and that really could pose problems for Russia militarily. But he says that Russia can do other things to try to intimidate them. He says already they try to intimidate the legislatures of those countries by essentially, moving in to speak to members of their parliaments to say, look, you either toe our line, in which case we'll reward you with money and other things, or we'll go after your opponents and offer these things to them, and we'll come after you tooth and nail. So he says they've already kind of made inroads into the legislatures of these other countries to get these lawmakers to kind of toe the Russian party line and do what Russia wants. These are other subtle ways that they already exert their influence, and he says we could see more of that.
Wow, so much at stake. Okay, Brian, we thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.